There is a fear more specific than inflation. It is the fear that the money you saved in is no longer the kind of money the world respects, that the currency you built a life in has stopped being the anchor and started being the problem. If you have felt that fear recently, watching the news, watching the dollar, then this video is for you because someone else felt it first and what they did about it is documented. Paris, February 4th, 1965. Charles de Gaulle is holding a press conference at the Élysée Palace. He is not speaking as a politician. He is speaking as a man who has studied what happens when the world's anchor currency starts to drift, because he lived through the last time it happened. He watched it destroy his country's reserves in 1931 when Britain devalued sterling. He swore France would never be caught holding paper promises when the music stopped again. He looks into the cameras and says, "What the United States owes to foreign countries, it pays at least in part with dollars it can simply issue if it chooses." This unilateral facility contributes to the gradual disappearance of the idea that the dollar is an impartial and international trade medium. It is in fact a credit instrument reserved for one state only. Then he does something no sitting head of government had done since the war. He orders the Bank of France to convert all of France's dollar reserves into physical gold and bring it home. Operation Vitus, empty the pocket. It took 44 boat trips and 129 flights. Over 3 years, 3,113 tons of gold left the vaults of the Federal Reserve in New York and the Bank of England in London and arrived in Paris. 6 years later, Richard Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar was no longer convertible to gold at any price. The anchor was cut. By January 1980, gold had risen from $35 per ounce to $850. France's reserves were intact. The countries that held dollars found they had been holding a currency that had lost, depending on how you measure it, between 87 and 96% of its purchasing power against gold in 9 years. De Gaulle had seen it coming in 1965. He had acted. And the forensic record of what happened to those who acted versus those who trusted the guarantee is one of the most instructive financial documents of the 20th century. Today, the dollar has weakened approximately 9 to 10% in 2025 alone. Gold has hit all-time records above $5,000 per ounce. Central banks have purchased more than 3,000 tons of gold in the last 3 years, the highest sustained buying rate since records began in the 1950s. The architects of current U.S. economic policy are openly discussing deliberate dollar depreciation as a tool. The term being used in financial capitals is the Mar-a-Lago Accord, a proposed restructuring of the global monetary order designed to weaken the dollar while keeping it nominally dominant. You are not watching a crisis. You are watching the early-stage signals that de Gaulle read in 1965. And this time, unlike Weimar or Argentina, the forensic record of what to do is not the story of a survivor in a failed state. It is the decision made by a sitting president of a major Western nation on behalf of his citizens with documented outcomes. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what happened to ordinary British savers when sterling lost reserve currency status, what the documented forensic record shows about asset outcomes in the decade after the gold window closed, and why the signal visible today is the same one de Gaulle read 50 years ago and what he did about it. Let's open the autopsy. Before we can understand what it feels like to hold the currency that loses reserve status, we need to understand what reserve status actually means for ordinary people. Not for central banks, but for the person with savings. When your currency is the world's reserve currency, every other nation on earth is effectively a buyer of your debt. Countries need your currency to conduct international trade. They hold it in their reserves. They buy your government bonds. This creates a permanent subsidy for your standard of living. Your government can borrow at lower rates than any other nation. Your imports are cheap because everyone accepts your money. You can run deficits that would bankrupt any other country, and the world simply absorbs them. The French called this America's exorbitant privilege. It cost only a few cents to print a $100 bill, but another country had to produce $100 worth of actual goods to obtain one. The British had enjoyed the same privilege for a century before America inherited it. And here is what the forensic record shows happens when that privilege ends. Not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly, in a way that looks manageable right up until it doesn't. September 18, 1949, a Sunday. Chancellor of the Exchequer. Sir Stafford Cripps goes on the radio and tells the British people that the pound has been devalued by 30.5%. The exchange rate was cut from $4.03 per pound to $2.80. 2 weeks earlier, Cripps had stood before Parliament and stated with complete confidence, His Majesty's government have not the slightest intention of devaluing the pound. 14 days from categorical denial to 30% devaluation. The British saver, who heard the guarantee on September 4th, held pounds worth $4.03 each. By September 19th, those same pounds were worth $2.80. No warning, no appeal, no compensation. This was not a unique event. It was the second major sterling devaluation in 18 years. In 1931, when Britain was last forced off the gold standard, the pound fell 24% in weeks. The French reserves that de Gaulle would remember 3 decades later lost 2.35 billion francs, twice the capital of the Bank of France. The French treasury had to bail out its own central bank because it had trusted sterling. Here is what the forensic record shows about sterling's long decline for ordinary British savers across that period. In 1913, the pound bought nearly $5. London was the banker to the world. Over 60% of international trade was invoiced in sterling. The pound was not merely money, it was the anchor of the global financial system. By 1950, it bought $4. By 1967, Prime Minister Harold Wilson devalued it again to $2.40 on a Saturday night. He then went on television the next morning and told a stunned nation, "The pound in your pocket has not been devalued." Technically true in domestic prices. In international purchasing power, it was false. By 2026, the pound buys approximately 1.27, a 74% decline from its pre-war value. This decline did not happen in a single crash. It happened across 40 years of slow erosion, punctuated by sudden devaluation events when the official rate could no longer hold. The British saver, who held sterling throughout that period, trusting that the world's reserve currency would hold its value, lost the majority of their international purchasing power, not in a single disaster, but in a succession of managed retreats. Each one was framed as a temporary adjustment. The people who came through best were not those who predicted each devaluation. No ordinary saver could do that with precision. They were the people who held assets not denominated in sterling, land, productive property, foreign currency accounts where accessible, and gold, not because of genius, but because of a structural understanding that the currency losing reserve status always makes the same promises and always breaks them the same way. Now here's the forensic record of what happened to American savers when Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. This case is the most directly relevant because the mechanism being discussed in Washington today is identical. August 15, 1971, a Sunday evening. Nixon addresses the nation from the Oval Office and announces that the dollar will no longer be convertible to gold. He tells Americans the dollar will be stabilized. The word he uses specifically is stabilize. He says this will protect the dollar from international money speculators. The price of gold on August 14, 1971 was $35 per ounce. That had been its fixed price for 27 years. By December 1971, it was $43. By mid-1972, it was $63. By 1973, it was over $100. By 1974, it was nearly $200. It retreated for 2 years, then climbed again. By the end of 1979, it was over $500. In January 1980, it hit $850, from $35 to $850 in 9 years, a 329% nominal gain for anyone who held physical gold. The investors who kept their savings in U.S. Treasury bonds and dollar accounts across that same period lost in real purchasing power approximately 70 to 87%, not from a stock market crash, not from a bank failure, but from a policy choice made on a Sunday evening, announced without warning, and framed as protection. Nixon's exact words that night, "Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation. If you're among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today." By 1980, consumer prices in America had doubled from 1971 levels. The people who trusted that sentence lost in real terms approximately 70 to 87% of their savings purchasing power. The structural difference between them and the gold holders was not intelligence. It was the decision made years before the Sunday evening announcement to hold something outside the institution that would make the announcement. Now here is the forensic principle that the British case and the American case both establish, and that makes both of them directly relevant to what you're watching today. Reserve currency transitions do not announce themselves with a crisis. They announce themselves with policy language, with deliberate devaluations framed as stabilization, with guarantees issued 2 weeks before they are broken, and with official statements that things are fine until suddenly they are not. The British pound's decline was visible across decades to anyone watching foreign exchange reserves, trade balances, and the structural gap between what Britain owed and what it held. The signals were available. Most ordinary savers did not read them, because why would you study foreign exchange mechanics when your currency had been the world's reserve for a century? De Gaulle read them. He remembered 1931. He watched the same structural signals reappear in the American case in the early 1960s. U.S. gold reserves were falling. The U.S. was running persistent balance of payments deficits. More dollars existed in the world than gold existed to cover them at $35 per ounce. By 1966, foreign central banks held $14 billion against only $13.2 billion in U.S. gold reserves. Of that, only $3.2 billion was available to cover foreign claims. The math did not work. Anyone looking could see it. De Gaulle did not wait for the crisis. He converted, he repatriated, and he put the physical metal in Paris. And this is what he said about gold in that 1965 press conference. Gold does not change in nature. It has no nationality. It is considered in all places and at all times the immutable and fiduciary value par excellence. The signal you hear in that sentence is not mysticism. It is the conclusion of a man who had watched two reserve currency guarantees fail within living memory and who had decided that the only asset worth holding was the one that required no government's promise to maintain its value. Here is what makes today directly recognizable from that record. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is not a rumor or a theory. It is a published policy document written by individuals like Stephen Moore, who became chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Its central thesis is that the dollar is overvalued as a result of its reserve currency status, and that this overvaluation should be corrected through deliberate depreciation. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has publicly described what he calls a grand global economic reordering. The dollar fell approximately 10% on a trade-weighted basis in 2025. These are not the statements of a government committed to defending the dollar's purchasing power. They are the statements of a government that has decided to use the dollar's reserve status as a lever. The framing is identical to 1971. The dollar will be stabilized, rebalanced, and made fair. The mechanism is the same. The official language is the same. And the forensic record of what that mechanism produces in documented historical outcomes is the chart that runs from $35 to $850. Meanwhile, central banks are acting exactly as de Gaulle acted in 1963. More than 3,000 tons of gold purchased in 3 years. Poland, which lived through its own hyperinflation in 1923 and watched what reserve currency faith costs when that faith is broken, is the world's most aggressive gold buyer, targeting 20% of its national reserves in physical metal. The gap between what central banks are doing and what governments are saying about currency stability is the same gap that existed between 1963 and 1971. The institutions that manage the world's reserves are converting paper claims to physical metal at the highest sustained rate in modern history. These are not the actions of institutions confident in the permanent stability of the current system. Here is the forensic protocol that the British case, the American 1971 case, and the French response to both establish. The first principle is that the guarantee is the last thing to go, but it always goes. Not the slightest intention of devaluing. Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow. The pound in your pocket has not been devalued. The language of reassurance is a structural feature of every reserve currency transition. The officials delivering it often believe it. They are wrong. They are wrong in the same direction every single time. The second principle is that the transition is gradual and then sudden. The British pound lost reserve status across 40 years of visible signals. The American dollar's Bretton Woods commitment eroded across a decade of visible signals before August 1971. In both cases, the saver who was paying attention had years to act. The person who acted on the gradual signals did not need to time the sudden event. The third principle is that physical assets outside the institutional system are the documented survivors, not gold ETFs, which are claims on gold held by an institution, not treasury bonds, which are claims on a government's promise, but physical metal held privately, land under direct personal control, and foreign currency held outside the banking system. These are the assets that survived 1931, 1949, 1967, and 1971 because they are the assets that cannot be devalued by a Sunday evening announcement. The fourth principle, which France adds, is this: watch what central banks do, not what governments say. When de Gaulle was converting dollars to gold in 1963, the U.S. Treasury was publicly confident about the dollar's stability. The gap between those two things is the signal. It has been the signal across every reserve currency transition in the documented record. The closing forensic verdict is this: de Gaulle did not need to predict August 15, 1971. He needed only to read what the structural signals were already saying. The fiscal position of the issuer, the gap between reserves and obligations, in the policy language of reassurance issued 2 weeks before the guarantees break. The reserve currency's promise is only as durable as the fiscal position of the country that issues it. When that position deteriorates beyond a recoverable threshold, the promise is not kept. Not in 1931 sterling, not in 1949, not in 1967, and not in 1971. The person who holds physical metal outside the institutional system today is not predicting when the announcement will come. They are making a structural observation about what the announcement will say when it does. If this forensic record changed how you read the current financial landscape, please subscribe and like this video. We are uncovering the history they tried to bury. Secure your future. The next chapter of the archive will open soon.